October 1980. The North Arabian Sea. The Soviet destroyer Boyki cuts through a flat metallic sea. The air is a furnace thick with salt and the smell of diesel. On the bridge, Captain Second Rank Valery Ivanov scans the horizon through his binoculars. S-carrier battle group centered on the USS Eisenhower, a floating symbol of American power now positioned menacingly close to the war in Afghanistan. For weeks, it has been a tense, slow ballet. The Soviet task force, 2 destroyers and a guided missile cruiser, shadows the Americans, a demonstration of Moscow's newfound reach. But the strain is showing. Ivanov knows his fuel reserves are calculated to the last litre. His sailors are on reduced water rations. Fresh food is a memory. Then, through the haze, a silhouette emerges. Then another. Not warships. Massive, blocky vessels moving with purpose toward the American formation. A fleet oiler, the USNS Kansas City. A fast combat support ship, the USS Seattle. From their spans, thick hoses and highlines snake across the water to the carriers and cruisers. Even as they steam at 20 knots, the American ships are taking on millions of gallons of fuel, thousands of tons of munitions, pallets of fresh food. On the Boyki's bridge, the radio intercept officer listens to the calm, routine chatter of the American Replenishment. Ivanov lowers his binoculars. The tactical reality is inescapable. The Americans are not just visiting this ocean, they are living here. And his own fleet, thousands of kilometers from the nearest Soviet port, is slowly, inevitably, running on empty. This single routine American operation would send a shockwave through the highest levels of the Soviet Navy. It revealed a gap in power not measured in missiles, but in the silent, relentless machinery of global reach. The war in Afghanistan, launched in December 1979, was a land war conceived by land power generals. The Soviet Union, the world's largest continental empire, moved its armies across the Amu Darya River with the brutal efficiency it had perfected since 1945. Tanks, BMPs and regimental artillery formed the spearhead of what the Politburo believed would be a swift, decisive intervention. The naval component of the Soviet armed forces, the Voenno-Morskoy Flot, VMF, was an afterthought in the initial invasion plan. Afghanistan had no coastline. The conflict's geography appeared to demand nothing from the admirals in Moscow. This perception shattered within months. The international reaction was swift and severe. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter, moved immediately to counter what it saw as a dire thrust toward the oil-rich Persian Gulf. For the Soviet Union, this doctrine transformed a regional counterinsurgency into a global crisis with a maritime front. Suddenly, the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea were not just trade routes, they were potential battlefields. The Soviet Navy was ordered to establish a permanent presence off the coast of South Asia, a show of force to deter American escalation and to protect the southern flank of the Afghan operation. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the architect of the modern Soviet Blue Water Navy, saw an opportunity. For decades, he had fought for resources to transform the coastal defense force of Stalin's era into a global power projection tool. Here was his justification. A shooting war on land required a powerful shield at sea, but ambition collided with a profound geographical reality. The Soviet Union was a prisoner of its own contours. Its 4 main fleets, Northern, Baltic, Black Sea and Pacific, were each bottled up by narrow, easily monitored choke points. The Gyuk Gap, the Danish Straits, the Turkish Straits, the Sea of Japan. To reach the Arabian Sea from its western ports, a Soviet squadron had to sail 15,000 nautical miles, a voyage taking over a month around the entire continent of Europe and Africa. From its Pacific Fleet base in Vladivostok, the journey through the South China Sea and Malacca Strait was shorter but just as politically fraught, passing through waters dominated by US allies, and upon arrival there was nothing. No friendly port, no secure anchorage, no depot. The Soviet Navy had no equivalent to America's Diego Garcia, no Bahrain, no Subic Bay. Their only potential points of support were the fragile, politically sensitive ports of South Yemen, Aden, and Ethiopia, Massawa, both thousands of kilometers from the patrol area and themselves vulnerable to blockade. Every shell, every missile, every liter of fuel, every loaf of bread for the Soviet sailors stationed to counter the US Navy had to be brought with them, or painstakingly shipped in via vulnerable, slow civilian tankers and freighters. This was the stark dichotomy as the 1980s began. On one side, the United States Navy, a force designed for permanent global presence, born from the lessons of the Pacific War and honed by decades of alliance building. On the other, the Soviet Navy, a formidable but territorially constrained force, now ordered to perform a sustained mission for which it was logistically ill-prepared. The stage was set not for a climactic sea battle, but for a slow, grinding demonstration of a deeper truth. In modern naval warfare, endurance is a weapon, and logistics is the platform from which all power is launched. This logistical asymmetry would become the silent, decisive front of the Cold War at sea. The Soviet admirals watching from their bridges were about to receive a masterclass in a form of warfare their doctrine had never truly accounted for. They had prepared to win a battle. The Americans were equipped to win a weight. While Soviet task forces stretched their supply lines to a breaking point, the United States Navy operated from an ecosystem of power unprecedented in maritime history. Its presence in the North Arabian Sea was not an expedition. It was the activation of a permanent global network. This system rested on three interdependent pillars: forward bases, international alliances, and the revolutionary capability of underway replenishment, UNREP. The cornerstone of the network was the island base of Diego Garcia. A solitary atoll in the central Indian Ocean, it had been transformed from a quiet British possession into one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate on Earth. By 1980, it featured a deep-water lagoon, a 12,000-foot runway capable of handling B-52 bombers, vast fuel farms, and expansive ammunition storage facilities. Diego Garcia was not merely a port, it was a floating, unsinkable warehouse positioned exactly halfway between the US Pacific Fleet and the new centre of gravity in the Middle East. From here, the US could service, arm and fuel its entire Indian Ocean fleet without ever needing to withdraw. For the Soviet observers, Diego Garcia represented a frustrating geopolitical reality. The US possessed what they could never legally acquire: sovereign, secure territory in the very heart of their intended operating area. This base was magnified by a web of alliances. The United States did not sail into the Arabian Sea alone. The UK granted access to Diego Garcia. France offered facilities in Djibouti. Oman, under Sultan Qaboos, provided critical airfield and port access at Masira Island and Salalah. Pakistan, having become the frontline state for supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, allowed covert use of its ports for logistics, supporting that very mission. Every one of these relationships gave the US Navy flexibility, redundancy, and depth. A Soviet naval planner looking at a map saw a vast, empty ocean. His American counterpart saw a linked chain of friendly harbours and airstrips, but the true marvel, the capability that turned these static assets into relentless, mobile, striking power, was the US Navy's underway replenishment fleet, the Oilers, Ammo and Beans teams. This was a specialised naval armada in itself, comprised of several critical classes of ship. AOE, fast combat support ships, the crown jewels of the system. Ships like the USS Sacramento class were designed as one-stop shops. They combined the capabilities of a fleet oiler, an ammunition ship, and a refrigerated stores ship into a single, fast hull that could keep pace with a carrier battle group cruising at over 20 knots. A single AOE could transfer over 200,000 barrels of fuel, 2,000 tons of ammunition, 500 tons of dry stores, and 250 tons of refrigerated food, all while underway. AOR, replenishment oilers. Slightly smaller but equally vital, these ships provided the liquid lifeline, aviation fuel for the carriers and diesel for the escorts. AE, ammunition ships, and AFS, combat stores ships. These were the floating arsenals and supermarkets carrying everything from Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles to fresh fruit and mail. The process itself was a ballet of precision and danger, perfected over decades. Ships would steam side by side in parallel courses, sometimes as close as 150 feet apart, connected by high-tension cables, highlines, and fat, rubberized fuel hoses. Teams of sailors on deck, often in heavy seas and blistering heat, would orchestrate the transfer of 1,000-pound bombs and pallets of supplies via zip lines, while millions of gallons of volatile JP5 jet fuel pumped through the hoses below. A well-drilled UNREP team could fully resupply an aircraft carrier and its escorts in a matter of hours, without any of them slowing from combat speed or altering their tactical formation. This meant a US carrier battle group could remain on station, combat-ready for months, even years, at a time. Its presence was not a fleeting visit, it was a permanent fact. The implications for the Soviet war in Afghanistan were direct and chilling. From these unshakable floating airfields, US naval aircraft could project power deep into Afghanistan if ordered. More immediately, these battle groups provided the secure shield under which the massive sea lift of weapons to the Pakistani port of Karachi for the Mujahideen was conducted. The Soviets could see the destination, but they lacked the means to interdict it. By the time the first Soviet destroyers arrived, panting and low on fuel, to shadow the USS Eisenhower in 1980, they were not just observing a group of warships, they were witnessing the output of an entire national industrial system and alliance structure. They had sailed into an ocean the United States Navy already owned, not by claim, but by the sheer mundane mechanics of sustained supply. The coming realization would be a profound shock to their professional pride and strategic calculus. They had measured navies in terms of missile tubes and tonnage. The Americans had mastered the calculus of beans, bullets, and black oil. This sets the stage for the multiple, deepening angles of Soviet shock, from the admiral's bridge to the intelligence analyst's desk, as the full, humiliating scope of their disadvantage came into focus. The reports landing on the desks of senior commanders in the Soviet Navy's main staff in Moscow, and with Admiral Gorshkov himself, were unambiguous. They were compiled from after-action dispatches from squadron commanders like Captain Ivanov, from GRU naval intelligence analysts, and from technical observations. They did not speak of a defeat in battle, but of a more profound, systemic failure. The American ability to resupply entire fleets in mid-ocean represented a quantum leap in operational art that Soviet doctrine had not adequately considered. For Admiral Gorshkov, a titan of Soviet military history who had shepherded the Navy from a coastal adjunct to a global nuclear-armed force, this was a personal and professional affront. His philosophy, encapsulated in his seminal work, The Sea Power of the State, emphasized the strategic role of the Navy in nuclear deterrence and in supporting ground forces. He had championed the construction of iconic, fearsome vessels like the Kirov-class nuclear-powered battlecruisers, ships designed to project awe and firepower. Yet now, in the mundane spectacle of a fleet oiler refueling a carrier, he saw the hollow core of his ambitions. His mighty surface combatants, symbols of Soviet engineering, were like magnificent birds of prey with clipped wings, unable to fly far from their nest. The American support ships, ungainly and unarmed, were what granted the Predators their global range. This shock transcended bruised ego. It forced a rapid, painful reassessment of strategic assumptions. Soviet naval planning, heavily influenced by the catastrophic logistics failures of the German Kriegsmarine and the Japanese Imperial Navy in World War II, had focused on securing sea lines of communication for invasion and defense of the homeland. The concept of sustaining a distant, standing battle fleet for months on end in a contested ocean was a primarily American, and to a lesser extent, British, imperial legacy. The Soviets had built a navy to win a short, intense war, likely culminating in nuclear exchange. The Americans had built a navy to win a long, global Cold War, and to sustain hot wars on its periphery indefinitely. The realization was encapsulated in a single, devastating comparison. A Soviet Sovremeny-class destroyer, a powerful anti-ship-focused vessel, had an operational range of approximately 4,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. It could dash to a location, but it could not linger. A US Spruance-class destroyer, paired with the UNREP fleet, had a theoretically infinite operational range. Its endurance was limited only by the morale of its crew and the mechanical wear on its engines. The difference was not in the warships themselves, but in the unseen, unsung tenders that trailed behind them. This angle of shock was therefore intellectual and doctrinal. It was the moment the Soviet admirals understood they had been competing in the wrong category. They had measured their success in missile salvo size and hull numbers. The true metric of blue water power was endurance, and in that contest they were not even in the race. The ocean was not a blank space to be crossed, but a domain to be inhabited. The Americans had learned to build a home there. The Soviets were condemned to be perpetual, anxious visitors. This professional dismay on the command level filtered down into a more tangible, tactical frustration for the officers and intelligence operatives tasked with the day-to-day shadowing mission, leading us to the next critical perspective. The shock of the American logistical system was not an abstract strategic concern for the Soviet sailors living it. It was felt in the grit of daily life, a tangible deficit measured in greying vegetables, warm beer, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of the fuel gauge. Aboard the Soviet destroyers and cruisers shadowing the US fleet, life became an exercise in austerity. A stark contrast played out in plain sight across a few hundred yards of open water. On the US side of that water, the routine was one of remarkable normalcy. Every 4 to 5 days, the supply ships would rendezvous with the battle group. The process, though dangerous, was routine. Sailors would receive fresh milk, eggs, and vegetables. Mail from home would arrive. Critically, magazines would be topped off, bombs lifted to flight decks, missile racks serviced, and CIWS phalanx systems fed their 20mm uranium-tipped rounds. A US sailor might complain about the food, but he ate ice cream. He might gripe about the workload, but he handled equipment that was fully maintained and supplied. Morale, while strained by long deployments, was underpinned by a fundamental certainty. The ship would not run out of what it needed to fight or to live. On the Soviet side, uncertainty was the constant companion. Soviet naval doctrine prioritized combat load over sustainment. A Slava-class cruiser carried an awesome battery of 16 SSN-12 sandbox anti-ship missiles, but its stores for a long deployment were an afterthought. Fresh food evaporated within 2 weeks, replaced by canned meats, hardtack, and preserved cabbage. Water was rationed for washing. Refrigeration was limited and unreliable. The most telling symbol was the Soviet sailors' beer ration. A welcome comfort, but often served warm because the ship lacked the electrical capacity to cool it all while also running combat systems. But the most critical shortage was fuel. Soviet ships, particularly their gas-guzzling gas turbine-powered destroyers like the Sovremeny class, were notorious for their thirst. The shadowing mission required constant maneuvering at varying speeds to maintain position with the Americans. Every course change, every burst of speed to close the gap was calculated against a dwindling supply. The captain's primary enemy was often not the US Navy, but the chief engineer's fuel report. The arrival of a Soviet tanker was a major logistical event, a vulnerable moment where the combatant ship would have to break station, steam to a prearranged point, and conduct a slow, stationary refueling, all while leaving the American group unobserved and exposing both vessels to potential surveillance or harassment. This disparity bred a specific, corrosive form of professional envy. Soviet lookouts and junior officers, watching through their own binoculars, would witness the American unrep evolution. They saw the efficiency, the abundance, the sheer industrial confidence of the process. They saw American sailors wearing new, clean uniforms, while theirs were salt-stiffened and worn. They saw helicopters ferrying pallets between ships with a casual frequency their own limited naval aviation could never match. The message was unambiguous. Their adversary was not merely present, they were comfortable, sustained, and ready to stay forever. They were fighting a war of attrition their own supply chain could not possibly win. This deckplate reality turned the vastness of the ocean from a theatre of operation into a prison of scarcity. The Soviet sailor's world shrank to the rusting confines of his own hull, while the American sailor's world remained connected to the entire industrial might of his homeland. The psychological impact was profound. It eroded morale, highlighted systemic failures, and created a visceral understanding of the gap between the two superpowers that no ideological training could overcome. The war was not just in the mountains of Afghanistan. It was here, in the empty belly and the near-empty bunker, a silent battle the Soviet Union was losing every single day. This daily logistical defeat was enabled by a technological and doctrinal edge that was decades in the making, a subject of intense and frustrated study for Soviet technical intelligence. The spectacle Soviet observers witnessed, ships connected by pulsating hoses and buzzing highlines while steaming at full battle group speed, was not improvisation. It was the culmination of half a century of focused American research, development, and doctrinal evolution. A technological ecosystem that gave the US Navy a sustainment capability with no true equivalent. The Soviet shock was, in part, a shock at the maturity of a system they had chronically underinvested in. The American UN rep system was a symphony of specialized equipment. At its heart were the standardized connection rigs, the span wire and highline systems. The standard tensioned replenishment alongside method, air stream, was the workhorse. It used a constant tension winch to maintain a taut wire cable between the two ships, compensating for pitch and roll in heavy seas. Along this wire travelled the probe, a trolley that could carry heavy loads, pallets of missiles, netted crates of supplies, or support fuel hoses. This system allowed transfer in Sea State 5 conditions, meaning the operation could continue in rough weather that would force a Soviet tanker to break away. For heavier, bulkier items like jet engines or helicopter rotors, the connected replenishment (CONREP) method using ram-tensioned lines provided even greater stability. The ships themselves were engineering marvels of throughput. A Sacramento-class AOE, Fast Combat Support Ship, was essentially 3 specialized vessels fused into one 53,000-ton hull. Its internal architecture was a maze of optimized logistics: deep fuel tanks segregated for different types of aviation and marine diesel, cavernous ammunition magazines with specialized elevators and hoists, and vast refrigerated and dry storage spaces. Its flight deck and hangar could operate multiple helicopters for vertical replenishment, VERTREP, adding a third dimension to the supply chain. Most importantly, its power plants could propel it at over 26 knots, allowing it to keep pace with the nuclear-powered carriers it served. Doctrinally, the US Navy treated UNREP not as a support function, but as a core combat capability. Every officer, from the captain down, was trained in its procedures. Replenishment at sea, RAS drills, were conducted with the frequency and rigour of gunnery practice. The crews of the combatants and the supply ships trained together incessantly, building the muscle memory and trust required to perform this dangerous ballet under the pressure of wartime conditions or while potentially under observation or threat from Soviet vessels. This institutional culture of seamless integration turned a complex mechanical process into a routine administrative event. In stark contrast, Soviet underway replenishment capabilities were primitive, fragile, and secondary. The Soviet Navy had replenishment ships, the Boris Chilykin-class fleet oilers and later the Berezina class, but they were slower, less capable, and far fewer in number. Their transfer equipment was less sophisticated, often requiring calmer seas and lower speeds. Critically, the doctrine was different. Soviet naval planning assumed that in a major conflict, replenishment would occur in secured anchorages close to home waters or via pre-positioning. The concept of conducting sustained high-tempo replenishment in the open ocean in a contested environment was not a central pillar of their operational art. Their supply ships were auxiliaries. The American supply ships were force multipliers. This technological and doctrinal gap created a tactical vulnerability the Soviets were acutely aware of. Their intelligence analysts knew that in a shooting war, their first strategic priority would have to be the destruction of the American UNREP fleet, a nearly impossible task given its integration within heavily defended carrier groups. Conversely, they knew their own few. Slow tankers were the soft underbelly of their distant deployments, easy prey for American attack submarines or long-range maritime patrol aircraft. The American system was resilient, distributed, and woven into the fleet's fabric. The Soviet system was a fragile, exposed tether to a distant homeland. Thus, the technological angle of the shock was the recognition of a self-reinforcing loop. Superior equipment enabled superior doctrine, which demanded more advanced equipment. The Soviets had invested in the spear tip. The Americans had invested in the arm that could thrust that tip, repeatedly and without fatigue, to any corner of the globe. This realization drove Soviet intelligence into a frenzy of collection, seeking to understand not just the weapons of war, but its mundane, vital plumbing. For the Soviet military intelligence apparatus, the GRU's Naval Directorate and the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Lines, the American logistical feat was not a sudden discovery, but the crystallization of a long-suspected and now undeniable strategic supremacy. Their task shifted from mere observation to frantic quantification. They were not just watching ships, they were attempting to audit an entire national capacity, and the numbers were terrifying. The intelligence flow was multi-layered. Signals intelligence, SIGINT, was paramount. Soviet AGI, auxiliary general intelligence vessels like the modified primary-class ships, would loiter at the edge of US fleet exercises and UNREP operations. Their forest of antennas sucked in electronic emissions, the routine radio chatter between the oiler and the carrier, pumping at 500 gallons per minute, standing by for line disconnect. The radar frequencies of the navigation and station-keeping systems, even the telemetry from automated tensioning winches. This raw data was sent back to analysis centers in Moscow and Vladivostok, where teams of specialists tried to build a model of American efficiency, how long a full replenishment took, how often it was required, what the supply ship's capacity implied about the battle group's endurance. Imagery intelligence, IMINTA, from satellites and long-range reconnaissance aircraft like the Tu-95RT Bear-D provided the visual proof. Panoramic photographs captured the entire scope of a U.S. carrier group being simultaneously serviced by 2, sometimes 3 supply ships. Analysts would painstakingly count pallets, estimate the diameter of fuel hoses to calculate flow rates, and note the types of munitions being transferred. They could see the fresh produce on deck. These images were not merely tactical, they were strategic indicators. A battle group receiving a full ammunition onload was preparing for potential combat operations. One taking on vast quantities of fuel and stores was bedding in for a long, uninterrupted patrol. Perhaps the most humbling intelligence came from open source OSINT and human intelligence, HUMINT. Soviet analysts subscribed to and scoured American professional naval journals like Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute. They read technical manuals and procurement requests published by the US government. These open sources detailed, often boastfully, the capacities of new classes of supply ships, improvements to UN rep rigging, and studies on sustained operations. Furthermore, agents in ports from Subic Bay to Norfolk reported on the comings and goings of the US Navy's Military Sealift Command, tracking the routine, industrialized rhythm of the global logistics network. They reported on the morale of US sailors, noting the availability of amenities that were unimaginable luxuries on their own ships. The collective picture that emerged for Soviet planners was one of a gap that could not be closed with a single weapons program. It was a capability gap rooted in national infrastructure. To match the USSR would need to 1. Build a large fleet of fast, specialized support ships, diverting resources from combatant construction. 2. Develop the advanced winching, coupling, and stabilized transfer technology, requiring a microengineering sector where they lagged. 3. Secure a global network of secure, deep-water ports, a geopolitical impossibility. 4. Cultivate a naval culture that prioritized supply as a core combat discipline, a doctrinal revolution. The intelligence assessment was therefore a counsel of despair. It showed that the visible symptom, the stunning mid-ocean resupply, was the product of a deep structural advantage. The US could do this not because it had clever sailors on the day, but because it had invested in the industrial base, the global alliances, and the institutional knowledge for half a century. The Soviet Navy had been built for a different kind of war, a short, violent conflagration decided by salvos of missiles. The Americans had built a navy to win a long, grinding confrontation of presence and pressure. In the sunny, empty expanse of the Arabian Sea, the Soviets found themselves in the Americans' chosen kind of war, and they were hopelessly outmatched. This intelligence verdict set the stage for the operational climax of this silent struggle. It forced the Soviet Navy into a reactive, defensive posture, culminating in a specific, tense incident that would lay bare their vulnerability for all to see and trigger a fundamental shift in their global naval strategy. The theoretical intelligence assessments and the daily frustrations of shadowing coalesced into a stark operational crisis in the spring and summer of 1984. The catalyst was a massive, deliberate, and highly visible US Navy exercise known as Operation Intense Look. This was not a war game hidden in the North Atlantic. It was a full-scale demonstration of power projection into the Indian Ocean, explicitly linked to the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. The message to Moscow was unambiguous. The United States could sustain overwhelming combat power on the Soviet southern flank indefinitely. The centerpiece was the USS Enterprise Carrier Battle Group, reinforced with a second carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, forming a potent 2-carrier strike force. This armada, over 24 warships including guided missile cruisers, destroyers, frigates, and attack submarines, sailed into the North Arabian Sea and began conducting sustained, high-tempo flight operations. The air wings simulated deep strike missions, combat air patrols, and anti-submarine warfare sweeps, burning through aviation fuel and ordnance at a staggering rate. And every 3 to 4 days, like clockwork, the replenishment force would arrive. The fast combat support ships USNS Kansas City and USS Detroit would integrate seamlessly into the formation. Soviet AGI ships and satellites recorded the relentless cycle. The highlines would go up, the fuel hoses would connect, and for hours the giant carriers would drink in millions of gallons of JP-5 while bombs and missiles flowed onto their decks. Then the supply ships would depart, only to be replaced by another pair days later. The battle group never slowed. It never approached a port. Its combat readiness never dipped. For the Soviet squadron tasked with monitoring this behemoth, usually a Kara-class cruiser like the Petropavlovsk and 2 Krivak-class destroyers, the exercise became an ordeal. Their orders were to maintain observation, to document, to show the flag. But the operational tempo of the Americans was unsustainable for them. While US fighters roared off catapults around the clock, Soviet sailors counted their remaining days of fresh water. While American deck crews handled new ordnance, Soviet engineers calculated the most fuel-efficient speed to merely keep the Americans on the horizon. The turning point, the moment of undeniable humiliation, came during a particularly extended phase of intense look. A Soviet Boris Chilikin-class fleet oiler, the Boris Butoma, was dispatched from Vladivostok to replenish the struggling shadowing force. Its transit was slow, predictable, and monitored every mile by US P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft. By the time it arrived in the patrol area, the Soviet combatants were critically low. The protocol required was archaic and risky. The warships and the tanker had to reduce speed to a near standstill, come alongside in a vulnerable stationary formation, and begin a slow pumping process that could take the better part of a day. US intelligence knew the rendezvous was coming. As the Boris Butoma approached the Soviet squadron, the US battle group just over the horizon deliberately shifted its own course. The American commander ordered a high-speed maneuver, pulling his entire formation, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, directly over the horizon line and into full visual range of the stalled Soviet replenishment evolution. The image was mortifying for the Soviet commanders. On one side of the seascape, the mighty, mobile, fully armed US fleet operating at the peak of its power, a testament to integrated, sustained warfare. On the other side, their own combatants dead in the water, lashed to a plodding tanker, utterly defenseless. For those crucial hours, the Soviet Navy was not a peer competitor. It was a target. A single US attack submarine, they knew, could have annihilated the entire group. A single flight of aircraft could have sunk the tanker, rendering the combatants immobile. The radio intercepts from the Soviet ships, likely captured by US SIGINT, betrayed a frantic anxiety. The discussion was no longer about monitoring the enemy, but about fuel transfer rates and minimizing exposure time. The tactical initiative had been completely ceded. This was not a battle lost, it was a premise invalidated. The Soviet Navy's attempt to maintain a counter-presence had been revealed as a logistical fiction. The Americans had not just demonstrated superiority, they had staged a deliberate public showcase of their adversary's greatest weakness. This engineered moment of exposure did not result in shots fired, but it triggered a profound strategic shock in Moscow. The after-action reports from the squadron commander to the fleet staff, and then to the main Navy staff and the Ministry of Defense, would frame the issue in the most urgent terms. The conclusion was inescapable. The current doctrine of distant surface operations against the US Navy was untenable. A fundamental, painful reappraisal of the entire Soviet naval strategy was now required. A retreat from the dream of global blue water parity to a more defensive and desperate reality. The humiliating spectacle of 1984 forced a reckoning that reached the highest levels of the Soviet military and political leadership. The reports from the Arabian Sea were irrefutable. Admiral Gorshkov, the longtime champion of a balanced ocean-going navy, found his influence waning in the face of this operational failure. The new brutal assessment, championed by senior officers in the Northern and Pacific fleets and by pragmatic thinkers in the General Staff, was simple. The surface fleet had lost the peacetime competition for sustained presence. To continue, it was to waste precious resources and expose major combatants to destruction in a conflict they could not sustain. This led to a decisive and historic pivot in Soviet naval strategy, finalized in high-level consultations through 1985-1986. The ambitious, forward-deploying Blue Water Doctrine, designed to challenge US carrier groups on the open ocean, was scaled back. In its place arose the Bastion, or Fortress Doctrine. This was a defensive, homeland-centric strategy that acknowledged logistical reality and played to the Soviet Navy's remaining strengths. The core logic of the Bastion Doctrine was a retreat to the Soviet periphery. Its primary, almost exclusive mission became the protection of the USSR's strategic nuclear deterrent, its ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. These were areas the Soviet Union could dominate through proximity to its own airfields, naval bases, and dense concentrations of forces. The goal was to sanitize these waters of NATO attack submarines and other threats, creating a secure zone where the Delta and Typhoon-class SSBNs could hide and survive to launch their second strike weapons in the event of nuclear war. This doctrinal retreat had immediate and visible consequences for the Indian Ocean and global deployment. 1. The end of permanent presence, the dream of a standing Indian Ocean squadron, evaporated. Surface deployments became shorter, more symbolic flag-showing voyages, not sustained combat patrols. The focus shifted entirely to the Northern and Pacific fleets. 2. Resource reallocation. Investment and construction priorities shifted dramatically. The building of large, expensive surface combatants like the Kirov battlecruisers, designed for open ocean anti-carrier warfare, slowed. Resources were funneled into the true pillars of the Bastion. Attack submarines, SSSNs, SSGNs. More Akula and Sierra-class SSNs to hunt NATO submarines intruding into the bastions. Long-range maritime patrol aircraft, more Tu-142 Bear F anti-submarine planes to patrol the vast Arctic approaches. Land-based naval aviation, enhanced focus on backfire bombers armed with long-range anti-ship missiles, which could strike from Soviet soil at carriers attempting to project power toward the bastions. Minor combatants and mine warfare. A new emphasis on smaller corvettes, frigates, and mine layers to defend the complex coastal approaches to SSBN sanctuaries. 3. The hollow promise of support ships. The planned construction of advanced large support ships like the 40,000-ton Berezina class, the Soviet answer to the AOE, continued, but only 2 of the 4 planned were ever completed. They were too little, too late. They symbolized an attempt to solve a problem that had already been strategically bypassed. Without a global network of bases and a fleet designed for indefinite deployment, they were solutions in search of a mission. The climax of this period was not a battle, but a strategic surrender to geography and logistics. The stunning capability of the US Navy to resupply at sea had not just won a peacetime contest of persistence, it had actively reshaped the force structure and grand strategy of its primary adversary. By proving it could outweight and outlast any Soviet surface group on the global periphery, the United States forced the Soviet Navy to abandon the world's oceans and retreat to its own icy moats. The open sea, the domain Admiral Gorshkov had fought for decades to claim, was effectively conceded. The turning point, therefore, was marked by silence and absence. The once crowded horizons near Diego Garcia grew quieter. The tense, close-quarters shadowing of US carriers became a rarer event. The war in Afghanistan would continue, but the great naval confrontation meant to shield it had ended before a shot was fired, decided not by missiles but by the inexorable mathematics of supply. The aftermath of this silent victory and deafening defeat would reshape navies and geopolitics for the decades to come. The Soviet strategic retreat to the Bastion Doctrine in the mid-1980s represented a clear, if unspoken, American victory in the war of naval logistics. Yet, like many Cold War triumphs, it was a victory that bred new complexities and laid the groundwork for future challenges. The immediate aftermath saw the consolidation of American supremacy, the hollowing out of Soviet naval ambition, and the seeding of a maritime strategy that would dominate the post-Cold War world. For the United States Navy, the lessons of the 1980s Indian Ocean operations were codified into dogma. The logistics-enabled persistence model was proven not just as a convenience, but as a war-winning strategy. This validation triggered a massive, sustained investment in the Military Sealift Command, MSC, and the prepositioning of equipment. The Supply Class AOE program was accelerated, ensuring that every carrier battle group would have a dedicated, fast, one-stop support ship. The strategic value of bases like Diego Garcia was deemed incalculable, leading to further expansion and fortification. The US had not only defeated the Soviet challenge at sea, it had authored the definitive playbook for global naval dominance, a playbook centered on the unglamorous, essential tools of replenishment ships, forward hubs, and alliance networks. Concurrently, the war in Afghanistan provided the perfect covert testing ground for the security of these sea lines of communication. The immense arms pipeline to the Mujahideen, from Egyptian and Chinese stocks paid for by the CIA and Saudi Arabia, flowed almost exclusively through the Pakistani port of Karachi, under the secure umbrella of the US Navy's Indian Ocean Fleet. The Soviets, hindered by their logistical inability to maintain a robust blockade force, could only watch impotently as the weapons that were bleeding their army dry were delivered with impunity just over the horizon. The sea lane itself became a weapon. For the Soviet Navy, the aftermath was an era of managed decline and institutional frustration. The grandiose global naval exercises of the 1970s ceased. The surface fleet, though still large on paper, was increasingly confined to regional waters. The morale of the officer corps, particularly those who had experienced the humiliation of the shadowing missions, suffered. They were now guardians of a fortress, not captains of a world-spanning fleet. The technological and doctrinal gap in underway replenishment was never closed. When the Soviet Union itself began to unravel in the late 1980s, the Navy was among the first services to see its budgets eviscerated. Ambitious projects were cancelled. The rusting hulks of once proud ships languished at their piers, symbols of a reach that had exceeded its logistical grasp. The most profound and direct consequence, however, was the fatal diversion of resources. The Soviet war in Afghanistan was a colossal drain on the economy. Simultaneously, the perceived need to compete with American naval power to build bastions, more submarines, and new classes of surface ships diverted billions of rubles and immense industrial effort into military sectors that yielded no economic return. The attempt to answer the US Navy's logistical miracle, even after retreating to a defensive posture, consumed capital that a stagnating Soviet economy could ill afford. The American strategy of sustained pressure, enabled by its sea-based logistics, had helped to trigger a classic case of imperial overstretch. The USSR was bled white in the mountains of Afghanistan and bankrupted trying to match a naval competitor in an arena where it was fundamentally disadvantaged. Thus, by the time the last Soviet troops crossed the Friendship Bridge out of Afghanistan in February 1989, their navy was already a shadow of its former aspirational self. It had lost the peacetime competition for global presence, and in doing so had consumed resources that might have prolonged the state it served. The bastions it built would soon have no homeland to protect. The aftermath for the Soviet Union was a compound failure, a lost war on land, precipitated and prolonged by a lost contest at sea. This dual collapse on land and sea did not, however, end the story. It simply transferred the legacy of this logistical confrontation to new actors and set the stage for the next chapter in naval warfare, where the lessons of endurance would be studied by rising powers with global ambitions of their own. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not end the strategic impact of the logistical duel fought in the Arabian Sea a decade earlier. Instead, its legacy was etched into the doctrines of the world's navies and began to manifest in unforeseen geopolitical consequences. The silent victory of the UNREP fleet created a template for power projection and illuminated vulnerabilities that would define maritime strategy into the 21st century. For the post-Cold War United States Navy, the lesson became sacrosanct. Strategic mobility equals strategic influence. The From the Sea and later Sea Power 21 doctrinal publications enshrined the concept of independent, sustained forward presence as the core of American naval power. The investment in the logistics fleet continued, evolving into the current expeditionary strike group and sea-based concepts. Ambitious plans to sustain entire expeditionary brigades from floating offshore hubs, a direct descendant of the carrier group's indefinite endurance. The success against the Soviets proved that in a world of shrinking overseas bases, America's true base was its ability to sustain itself at sea. This doctrinal confidence underpinned every subsequent intervention, from the Gulf War to the long post-9/11 deployments, where carrier groups remained on station for months, their presence a routine, expected fact of global affairs. The blowback, however, was already taking shape. The very success of the CIA-ISI pipeline to the Mujahideen, safeguarded by those invulnerable sea lanes, had unforeseen consequences. The ideological fervour, the international Mujahideen networks, and the vast quantities of leftover weapons, most notably Stinger missiles, did not vanish with the Soviet withdrawal. They fermented in the chaos of post-Soviet Afghanistan and Pakistan. The alumni of this war, empowered by tools delivered via secure maritime logistics, would eventually turn their focus on their former benefactors. The blowback manifested catastrophically on September 11, 2001. orchestrated by an organization whose roots were deeply embedded in the CIA's proxy war. The US Navy, which had so effectively shielded the supply lines for that war, would now find itself launching carrier air wings against targets in the very same region, in a conflict spawned in part by its earlier victory. For Russia, inheriting the shattered remnants of the Soviet Navy, the lessons were bitter, but learned. The post-Cold War Russian Navy abandoned any pretense of global competition with the US for decades. It shrank into a coastal defense and strategic deterrent force, the Bastion Doctrine made permanent by economic necessity. However, under Vladimir Putin, a new asymmetric naval strategy has emerged, one that internalizes the logistical lessons of its defeat. Instead of trying to match American sustainment, Russia focuses on area denial weapons, long-range land-based anti-ship missiles like the Bastion P system, to create modern high-tech bastions in regions like the Black Sea, Kaliningrad, and the Eastern Mediterranean. They cannot resupply a fleet globally, but they can make it dangerous for the US Navy to operate near Russian shores. Furthermore, Russia has invested heavily in a small number of highly capable, long-range replenishment ships for its limited carrier and cruiser task forces, a belated and focused acknowledgement of the critical weakness exposed in the 1980s. Most significantly, the student that studied this historical episode most closely was not Russia, but China. The People's Liberation Army Navy, per plan, analysts dissected the Soviet failure and the American success. They understood that to challenge US primacy in the Western Pacific, they needed to solve the same logistical equation. China's answer has been the String of Pearls and, monumentally, the Belt and Road Initiative, a dual strategy of building commercial ports with potential military utility across the Indian Ocean, like Gwadar in Pakistan and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, while developing a world-class fast replenishment fleet of its own. The plan has launched multiple modern Fuyu-class fast combat support ships, near copies of the US Supply class, and the massive Type 901 AOE, a 45,000-ton behemoth designed to service its new aircraft carriers. They are building the very global network of access and the sustainable at-sea support capability that the Soviets lacked. They are attempting to create a hybrid model, American-style sustained reach, protected by Russian-style area denial bastions near home. Thus, the aftermath of the Soviet admirals' shock reverberates today. It validated a model of naval power that still defines the US fleet. It contributed to a cycle of blowback that reshaped global security, and it provided the definitive case study for America's next great strategic competitor, which is now diligently constructing the logistical infrastructure to avoid the very trap that ensnared the Soviet Union. The contest is no longer over who has the most missiles, but over who can build and secure the most resilient, far-reaching lifeline. The silent war of the oilers continues. The shock that rippled through the Soviet Navy in the early 1980s was more than a moment of tactical surprise. It was a profound, systemic revelation. For decades, the calculus of naval power had been measured in visible, quantifiable terms. Displacement tonnage, missile launch tubes, top speed, and radar range. The Cold War at sea was portrayed as a contest between sleek destroyers and hulking aircraft carriers, a duel of sensors and salvos. Yet in the empty expanse of the Indian Ocean, a different, older truth reasserted itself with quiet, brutal force. The true foundation of maritime dominion is not the weapon, but the will to sustain it. It is the mundane miracle of the fresh orange, delivered to a sailor 10,000 miles from home. It is the engineering of a coupling that can transfer volatile fuel between two giants heaving in a seaway. It is the geopolitical patience to cultivate alliances and secure anchorages across decades. The American resupply operation was a spectacle of routine efficiency, but what it truly displayed was the depth of a national commitment, industrial, logistical, and diplomatic, that the Soviet Union could not replicate. They had built a navy of spectacular moments. The Americans had built a navy of endless duration. This episode stands as a timeless lesson in the nature of military power. Strength is not merely about the capacity to strike, but the capacity to stay. It is about turning the ocean from a barrier into a highway, and a highway into a home. The Soviet admirals' dismay was the recognition that their formidable fleet was, in a strategic sense, a prisoner of its own coastline. Their reach was finite, tethered to the length of a supply chain that could be stretched but never transcended. In the end, The story of the mid-ocean resupply is a story about foundations. The Soviet vision of sea power was constructed on the volatile bedrock of ideology and martial bravado. When tested against the simple, grinding need for fuel and food, it fractured. The American model, for all its complexities, was built on the more solid, if less glamorous, foundations of global commerce, treaty alliances, and logistical science. The shock felt on the bridges of those Soviet destroyers was the sound of a paradigm breaking, the moment a great power understood that it had mastered the art of the battle, but had hopelessly lost the campaign of endurance. The echoes of that realization define our world today. As new powers look to the seas, they study not just the aircraft carriers and the missiles, but the support ships that trail in their wake. They seek to replicate not just the fist, but the arm that can wield it without growing weary. The lesson of the Arabian Sea endures. In the long, silent contest of wills between nations, the winner is often not the one with the sharpest spear, but the one with the strongest, longest, and most patient hand.